Welcome to another edition of Off Air, the new TV chat show, which has got everybody talking. It's live, of course, on Talk Radio every single week, and we have a top guest every single week. Today, my guest is James Bickerton, political campaigner and journalist. James, a very good afternoon to you. Welcome.
No, thank you very much for having me.
Now, the reason I've got you here, right, and this may come as no surprise to you, is that you are the man that I'm crediting with basically doing away with Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn is a busted flush, a spent force, largely due to your campaign against him.
I would very much like to take credit. I think we can take a very small amount of the credit, and emphasis on small, but
Yeah.
we did our best.
Tell us a little bit about how you started the campaign, because
Sure.
you've got a website, you've got a Twitter account. The first time you and I encountered each other, actually, was on the eve of the election, I suppose, or maybe a month or so before the election.
Yeah.
We did an election debate here at Talk Radio, and James was kind enough to come along and be one of the panellists. And that was when I discovered that you had this kind of campaign against Jeremy Corbyn. When did it start?
So it started back in April. So the original thinking was, my view was, going back to the kind of 2017 general election, looking at the Tory campaign, what the Tories were talking about, there was so much material I felt which should be being used about Corbyn, against Corbyn.
Yeah.
So there was all this stuff about, having John McDonnell praising the bravery of the IRA. I mean, that's just so far over the line as far as I'm concerned,
Yeah.
so morally unacceptable. And I was kind of expecting the Tory campaign to make use of all this. I was expecting, Theresa May is going to start talking about all this and all the anti-Semitism and all the times that Corbyn spent associating with or defending terrorist groups, etc. Because these are just so far over what I think is kind of morally acceptable. And it just never happened. It was just Theresa May going strong and stable.
Well,
strong and stable.
she strangely enough ended up inviting him into the tent, didn't she? Because when it got to the point under the sort of the late spring, when it looked like March the 29th wasn't going to happen, suddenly she's inviting Jeremy Corbyn into Downing Street to talk about ways of getting through the Brexit stalemate. I was thinking, what are you doing that for? What on earth are you doing that for? And funnily enough, the most sort of vociferous voices against Corbyn came from within the Labour Party in the end.
I mean, I think there were definitely some people within the Tory party who I think were naive about just how bad Corbynism was. I mean, they kind of regarded Corbyn as a bit worse than a normal Labour leader, but my view is he was so much worse.
Yeah.
He was basically beyond the moral pale. I mean, in some quite fundamental issues. So, I mean, think about kind of attachment to representative democracy. I mean, John McDonnell once said at a rally, I think democracy isn't working for us. Elections aren't working for us. He called for insurrection.
Yeah.
I mean, these people, again, John McDonnell's probably worse than Corbyn at this, but these people repeatedly associated with or praised groups for engaging in political violence.
Yeah.
I mean, John McDonnell was saying that no Tory MP should be able to go anywhere in the country without facing direct action.
Yeah.
I mean,
it was one of the things that I used to say a lot of on Twitter, that the Labour Party was the real nasty party, because one of their kind of slogans was about the Tories being the nasty party because they want to kill poor people, which of course is absolutely utter rubbish. But the Labour Party really has become a very nasty piece of work, hasn't it?
Yeah, and also astonishingly racist.
Yeah.
I mean, so one of the things that kind of motivated me to start the group was it would have been back in 2018 when there was a protest outside Parliament by British Jews worried about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And I went down as a journalism student to kind of talk to people, and I filmed quite a lot of interviews. And person after person said to me on record either that they were seriously considering leaving the country, as a British Jew, if Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, or that they have friends and families who are. And I mean, similarly, there was a poll by Jewish News just before the election that found over 40% of British Jews would seriously consider leaving the UK if Corbyn became Prime Minister. And Corbyn spent pretty much his entire career, I mean, decades, defending and associating with just about every anti-Semite you could think of, to a quite extraordinary extent. So I mean, I agree, Labour is absolutely the nasty party, but right now it's also the racist party, which is.
And was that all born out of? Do you think that his kind of? I mean, obviously his background is very much a left-wing kind of firebrand type person, backer of the Palestinian movement and all of that, backer of the IRA. But did it become something else in the sense that he realised that the Muslim vote in this country was actually going to be quite important? Therefore, that's why they haven't dealt with anti-Semitism in the way that they should.
I don't think that's the main issue. I mean, I think there's always been a problem with left-wing anti-Semitism. I mean, it goes back, all the way to the origins of Marxism.
Yeah.
I mean, Marx, despite being coming from a Jewish background himself, says some pretty nasty things about the Jewish religion and the Jewish faith. I mean, the Soviet Union was at times deeply anti-Semitic. Stalin was pretty anti-Semitic. So there's always been a long strain of left-wing anti-Semitism, because it kind of merges with the kind of the anti-capitalist idea, the idea that the Jews control the banks, the banks are evil.
Which is a pretty objectionable conspiracy theory, apart from anything else.
I know, which is just ridiculous. It's utter rubbish. But that's kind of where it comes from. And more recently, it's kind of morphed into something slightly different with the Israel-Palestine issue. Because a lot of kind of left-wing activists, or there's a certain type of left-wing activists, including Corbyn, who basically will oppose any country they regard as Western, or as kind of having a capitalist democratic system of government.
Well, his kind of instinct, which was to back Iran rather than the United States of America, it kind of tells you all you need to know, really, isn't it?
I mean, so I went along just to watch. There was a Stop the War Coalition rally in Trafalgar Square where Corbyn spoke, and this was a protest against the killing of Soleimani. And they were waving Iranian flags, they were communist flags. One guy had a North Korean flag, and Corbyn was just addressing this crowd of nut jobs, frankly, as though it's the most normal thing in the world. I mean, if he was Prime Minister, can you imagine what that would have done to...
Oh, just incredible. And I mean, I used to, like you, kind of sit around incredulous that, one, he had actually got into power, because at the beginning it was all a bit of a joke, wasn't it? When he was running for the leadership in the contest, I think there was a lot of Tories who signed up to the Labour Party just to vote him in to see if they could make it happen for a laugh, because actually they thought, this guy's never going to get into power as a Labour Prime Minister, so it's probably great for us if he runs the party, because he'll drive it into the ground. And so it has proved.
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting argument, because I mean, at the time I was working in Parliament for Tory MP, so obviously I remember talking to a lot of the other kind of Tory staffers, and to be honest, most of them were delighted when Corbyn was. I was relatively unusual in that I thought that because of the way our electoral system works, realistically, the government is going to be Labour or the Conservative, and having one party taken over by extremists means there's always a risk it could get in just if the other party performs badly enough, because it's the only alternative. So I was always more worried, just that I always thought there was a serious chance of Corbyn could get in. I think in 2017 he came quite close. I mean, if Grenfell had happened a few weeks earlier and Theresa May responded as badly as she did when it actually happened, I mean, would that push him over the line? I don't know, but it's a scary thought.
Certainly in the last election, I mean, up until, and I've said this before, up until around about sort of 9:45 on election night, I was actually worried that he might have done it, because there was a lot of evidence that seemed to suggest, and we'll come on to this question as to why, there was a lot of kind of, I was slightly unnerved by the credibility that he was given by an awful lot of broadcasters, for example. I mean, I remember after the first debate he had with Boris Johnson, where Boris hadn't really performed terribly well, and Corbyn actually hadn't been that bad. And you thought, and after that, suddenly you felt like people were seeing him as possible prime ministerial material, which they hadn't really done before. And then suddenly on the night, I started seeing reports coming in of high turnouts, and people queuing around the block. It turned out a lot of the queues were being forced on people because there were fewer polling stations actually open, but we didn't get told that, you know. And I'm thinking, Christ almighty, could he have possibly done this? You know, could it? But of course, it was in London where he did do it a little bit to an extent. But right up until the exit poll came out at 10 o'clock on that December the 12th night, I was thinking this could go either way.
Yeah, I mean, I was nervous as well. I mean, part of what unnerved me so much was almost the collaboration of a large part of kind of liberal or centrist Britain. So, for example, I mean, the SNP have made it bleedingly obvious that they were prepared to prop up a Corbyn government in return for another referendum on breaking up the UK. But the Lib Dems, I don't think they would have gone into a formal coalition, but I think that they kind of hinted at a supply confidence, some kind of informal arrangement in return for another
Lib Dems kind of shot themselves in the head, though, didn't they? By thinking that they were actually in a position to become the next government.
They absolutely did.
You know.
But I think there were a lot of people kind of who see themselves as liberal centrist, who, under normal circumstances, wouldn't give Corbyn the time of day, who were so angry about Brexit, so determined to stop Brexit, and that was kind of the only thing they really cared about. But they were prepared to ally.
Now that it's happening at the end of this week, by the way, it seems a rather quaint notion that anyone could be so much against something that is so obviously now happening.
Yeah. But I mean, definitely, I think a lot of kind of liberals, a lot of centrists were so obsessed with stopping Brexit that they were prepared to support Corbyn or prop up Corbyn, even, despite his racism, despite his links to terrorist groups, despite the fact that he spent, you know, his entire career hanging around with the Communist Party and various extremists. And kind of linked to that, I think there's, amongst the kind of the media, the broadcasters, the comedy scene, there's a whole kind of batch of areas. I think there's a failure to see the far left as a threat on par with the far right. I think as a society we're very good at kind of seeing the warning signs for the far right and knowing what to look for. But we're absolutely terrible with the far left, which means that you can be on the far left. You can be essentially anti-democracy. You can be in the Communist Party because the Communist Party opposes parliamentary democracy. and you can still hold quite meaningful positions in the media, in comedy, in
Well, I mean, one of the
British
guys, I
society.
suppose, who you would look at as a guy who kind of literally became deranged during the course of last year would be Paul Mason, a guy who sort of started off the year, or maybe I'm thinking it was before that, but who was, you know, a relatively sane a sort of a political correspondent stroke economics correspondent on a regular television show.
Yeah.
Who then suddenly became this mad firebrand sort of commie, placard waving, you know, mad staring eyes nutter.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where he still is.
Yeah, no, Paul Mason's interesting, but I mean, he still sometimes comes out with very interesting analysis. I mean, I don't agree with it, but I find it interesting. And then sort of half of it's very interesting, half of it's just nuts.
Yeah.
And you're never quite sure what you're going to get with him.
Right.
But I mean, ironically,
he's now very critical, of course, of Corbyn, which he wasn't before the election.
Yeah. I mean, the Corbynites are turning on him
Right.
because he hasn't backed Rebecca Long Bailey. He backed Keir Starmer.
Right.
And he's got a lot of flack over that. So ironically, his kind of base has been turning against him.
So tell us a bit about your campaign and what it actually did, because if Theresa May wasn't picking up on your sort of, you know, your suggestions and your information, how was it affecting the general sort of state of mind about Jeremy Corbyn?
Sure. So we were worried that no one was really talking about what we saw as the real issues. I mean, the people were criticising Corbyn's economic policy. I mean, obviously the Tories were doing that a lot. But no one was focusing on what we thought was really fundamental issues, which was just this guy and a lot of people around him just aren't committed to core democratic values in the way that every other past Labour leader has been, and you know every other past Tory leader as well since you know the age of universal suffrage. And we just thought it was really, really scary that this guy who spent decades palling around with terrorist groups, with anti-Semites, with dictatorial regimes, praising dictatorial regimes. I mean, he attended a...
Well, Venezuela was one of his pet projects.
Exactly, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran. I mean, taking money from the Iranian propaganda.
Well, he worked for Press TV, didn't he?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he continued working for Press TV after they lost their UK broadcast licence for airing confessions aired by torture. He attended an event to celebrate the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, and specifically to celebrate it, and that's a regime which produced a theocratic dictatorship. Yeah. And we just thought that all these kind of questions didn't really seem to be being addressed, and there wasn't enough kind of focus on this. So we launched. We weren't really expecting that much to happen. We were expecting kind of like a few hundred followers on Twitter, a little bit, but it just blew up. So I think in the first 24 hours we got 5,000 Twitter followers. I mean, we had some quite high-profile people. So Rachel Riley advised people to come involved with us. She's been quite helpful. Some kind of high-profile people, very kind. And as I say, we started getting contacted by donors, contacted by lots of people.
So you actually had people giving you money for this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that was so. When I set it up, I launched a group in April, but it only really got going in June. And when it launched in June, so that's kind of the online launch, we had a donation option, but I wasn't really expecting much money to come in. I was thinking, it might be like a $5 here or there. But we got quite sizable sums of money quite quickly, and that really surprised me. And again, when the election was announced, we started getting a lot more donations as well. And I mean, we were kind of a bunch of, a small group operating from bedrooms, basically.
Right.
We were.
So what did you do with the money? I mean, I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but I mean,
no, So most of it went on Facebook advertising.
Okay.
So I mean, Facebook was our biggest thing. I mean, in the week before the election, we got about over 2 million Facebook impressions on our core page.
Okay.
And there were certain. What we found is that if you got the targeting right and the demographics right, you could spend a relatively small amount of money and get a really big reach.
Yeah.
So
Facebook advertising is incredibly well put together, isn't it? I mean, we've heard Nick Clegg over the course of the last few weeks. Sort of making a bit of a fool of himself by denying that something could have happened, particularly with the old Jeff Bezos, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia hacking job. But it's I mean, I've dabbled in a bit of that when I was involved in an entertainment business before, and it's kind of it's very easy to target the people that you want to find. It's so better specific. Probably than anything else.
I mean, the thing that really interested me and kind of almost slightly surprised me is that the demographic that was most receptive to our content, and the success was borne out by election result, was working class voters.
And was it an age-related thing? Was it younger working class voters?
So older working class voters were the people who were most receptive to our content. Right. And I mean, we did a lot of stuff on Corbyn's past links or associations with the IRA. John McDonnell praising the bravery of the IRA.
Because one of the things that was said in 2017 was that the newspapers writing about all of that stuff had no effect on the young, because the young didn't really remember the IRA, and they didn't remember what they'd done to this country.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I mean, certainly with younger demographics, we found that the IRA stuff was a lot less effective. I guess because they don't remember it. But again, we're going to go off on a tangent a bit, but I do partly think it's about kind of the media and the education system, failing to inform people. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. We got to a situation where we could quite easily have had a guy running our economy who praised the bravery of a group that was bombing and murdering, hundreds of British citizens just a couple of decades ago.
Right.
I mean that should be morally beyond the pale.
It should.
And if a Tory,
but what does it say about the Labour Party and what the Labour Party has become, that this guy has been in charge of it now for quite a long time, and despite his ineffectual kind of performances at elections, and I include 2017 because if you can't beat Theresa May, in one of the most unpopular sort of points in her career, because you're not really clever enough, that tells you all you need to know. I mean, he shouldn't have really been anywhere near taking him into the last election.
No, absolutely. I mean, the Labour Party, in my view, it's rotten to the core at the moment. I mean, it almost became a different party when Corbyn took it over.
Yeah.
I mean, so many people from every kind of far left party under the sun came in, including quite senior people. So Andrew Murray, who's one of Corbyn's most senior aides, was a Communist Party member until 2016.
Right.
I mean, once urged solidarity with North Korea. That's how extreme he was.
Right.
But all these kind of far left actors came in.
People like him.
Yeah.
I'm surprised you didn't get sort of done over by these guys, and I mean in all sorts of different ways, because they're not very nice people.
No, so we were always very careful about physical security. I mean, we had threats. We never went to the police, or I never went to the police, but we did have threats of violence. And some of the people we were working with, because we worked quite a lot with, there were various Jewish groups that did a lot of work on anti-Semitism, and some of them had really serious threats. So I was talking to a guy who was on advanced police response time, that kind of thing. Yeah. And some of the emails we got sent were just, incredible. I mean, gratuitously anti-Semitic, gratuitously, saying we were funded by Israel, you're funded by the Jews, you're funded by, I mean, really nasty stuff. So yeah, I mean, there are some very nasty people on the far left, and you have to be careful, and we were quite careful.
Yeah, and so where do they go now? Because looking at the rundown of candidates, I mean, it doesn't exactly fill you with glee, does it? I mean, I had the misfortune of watching Sir Keir Starmer's video over the weekend, and one thing actually that struck me about it was very white. Yeah. At one point I thought to myself, clearly there's something going on here. He's obviously trying to appeal more to the white working class than anybody else. It was all shot in sort of various council estates, and then occasionally a couple of brown faces would pop up, but it wasn't like an old sort of Corbynist Labour agenda, which would normally be much more kind of diverse and not quite aimed at as many white people as this one was. But it was terribly boring, and a lot of the people that have seen it were saying, Keir Starmer's managed to make himself even more boring than Ed Miliband, which is saying something.
Yeah. No, I mean.
But are the Corbynists still sort of in charge of the party, I suppose, is my question.
They control the party apparatus. I mean, the General Secretary is a Corbynista. I mean, most of the people in the work at Labour HQ are now Corbynistas. So even if you replace them with someone like Keir Starmer, who's relatively speaking a moderate, it will still take a very long time to root out the Corbynite presence within the Labour Party. Yeah. I mean, they're dominant. I mean, there was a poll recently about who was the best Labour leader ever, and Corbyn amongst Labour members, and Corbyn won by a country mile.
Which is incredible, isn't it?
He defeated Attlee. He defeated
the man who invented the NHS. Right? Harold Wilson.
Exactly, and this was a guy who lost Labour 2 elections. Yeah. So I mean that just shows just.
So it is really a cult now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so deep rooted. I think it's a real sickness. And if Labour somehow ends up with a moderate leader, so someone like Keir Starmer, relatively moderate, I mean by comparison, rather than Rebecca Long-Bailey, who's obviously the continuity Corbyn candidate, it's going to take years, perhaps even decades, to properly root out the far left if they want to do it.
And so what about somebody like Lisa Nandy? Do you think she stands any chance at all?
Yeah, I think she's a serious candidate. I mean, I think she's been doing quite a lot of stuff as well about reconnecting with kind of Labour's the red wall, as they call it, the old. Well,
she's one of the few people who's actually now come out and said that their position on Brexit was entirely wrong. Yeah. She's also a woman who tried to explain her position on Brexit to me in the talk radio tent down in Westminster once, which is a very funny, if you haven't seen it, a very funny video where she at one point says to me, "Now you're just being difficult," to which the mother of my children said, "You should try living with him." But basically she more or less said, in words of her own, that she was going to support Leave because she was in a Leave constituency, but the other Labour members would support Remain if they were in Remain constituencies. And I just went, well, that's not going to work, is it? Because nobody's going to believe it. And I told so many of them that, because I sort of bizarrely became the de facto go-to person on talk radio for the Labour front bench before the election happened, because none of them would go on Julie Hartley-Brewer's show, because she's been banned famously from Labour conference because she did that funny video, which they didn't think was funny, about finding a safe space, you know. So they would also, I used to get John McDonnell, a couple of times he came on, and I would always try and sort of rile him to the point where, you know, I'd mentioned the IRA. I remember once, I think they once, on the anniversary of the Birmingham pub bombings, they launched some Labour manifesto promise in Birmingham. And I said, do you not think that's a bit insensitive? And he actually dealt with it quite well, and I was never quite able to get him going in a way that I think a few years ago it would have done. And I must admit, I was very happy to see at the end of the election process that he was the first to sort of say he was stepping aside. Because I was worried if he had got in, that he would have been far more dangerous than Corbyn ever would.
I completely agree. I mean, Corbyn's associated with a lot of dodgy people, but generally he didn't personally endorse violence or personally praise violence.
Well, he was described by various people as a man of peace, a man who's fought racial discrimination his entire life.
I mean that was all ridiculous. But John McDonnell was far more blatant and open. So whilst Corbyn spent a lot of time kind of hanging around with Sinn Féin, inviting former IRA bombers to Parliament, speaking at Sands Connolly commemorations for prisoners of the IRA, that kind of thing, he tended to avoid literally saying, I support the violence of the IRA, which McDonnell did not. McDonnell said, you know, specifically, he praised the bombs and bullets of the IRA, the bravery of the IRA. I mean, John McDonnell was...
And he more or less legitimised it, didn't he?
Oh, completely. He was entirely open about the fact he supported political violence. I mean, to be honest, he was quite lucky not to get his collar felt. And if a Tory MP had been praising some kind of right-wing terrorist group, I mean, they would have lost a whip immediately. They would have been kicked out of the party. So the fact that John McDonnell was tolerated by Labour and to some extent by kind of the media and respectable society.
Well, McDonnell got very good at being in front of a camera.
Oh, he was very
Whereas
good,
Corbyn, even throughout, until sort of almost the end of the election campaign, he was still that grumpy guy who would look at people as if they had no right to ask him any sort of question at all. I mean, that famous thing where he slams the car door, which I know is after he's lost the election, but there's somebody outside his front door in Islington, and he comes out and says nothing, just scowls, and then gets in the car and literally practically pulls the door off its hinges, you know. And that's his problem. He's just grumpy all the time.
I mean, John McDonnell was, I think he was very good at hiding a lot of his true views.
I
mean, he kind of admitted to them before he became Shadow Chancellor. I mean, he said that Lenin, who's was a communist dictator, is one of his main inspirations. But he kind of toned that down. You know, he put on a nice jumper and he did the sort of nice granddad act. Whereas Corbyn, the thing about Corbyn is he was never very good at media scrutiny. He almost acted as though the media didn't have the right to scrutinise him. Which, when you look at some of the countries he's praised and associated with in the past, like Venezuela and Cuba, where the media is treated very differently, does kind of make you think.
I think if he had got in, we would have had a very similar media to the one they have in Cuba. You know, because he would have insisted on shutting down the bits of it that he didn't like.
I certainly think there would have been a serious attack on media freedom, like this country hasn't seen.
Well, I mean, let's hope. But certainly for the next 5 years, they're kind of irrelevant, and it doesn't really matter who they elect. But I mean, whether it's Keir Starmer or whether it's Lisa Nandy or whether it's Rebecca Long-Bailey, I mean, I just don't think they're going to be relevant. I mean, one thing that I find ridiculous now is watching Prime Minister's Questions week after week, where Jeremy Corbyn looks increasingly just pointless, you know, and Boris Johnson clearly pays no attention to him because he doesn't need to.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I totally agree. The only qualifying point is, I'd say that because of our electoral system, because we either have a Labour or Tory government, if the Tories really mess up, which is not beyond the realms of possibility,
no, that's true.
Then the only alternative is Labour. And if Labour is still fundamentally a Corbynite party at that point, we could still end up with a very dangerous government.
Yeah, interesting.
That's the only kind of counterpoint.
End of this week, big historic event. We leave the European Union. 11 o'clock Friday. What are you going to be doing?
So I'll be working.
Really?
Yes, I'll be editing the Daily Express website.
Okay.
I had originally been hoping to go down to Parliament Square and go and record some interviews and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But say unfortunately I'm on duty.
Well, you can get somebody else to do that, can't you?
Well, we have got someone going. Yeah. But that was my hope. But no, it's going to be an incredible day. I think it'll be a really interesting day.
And when we awake, do you think on Saturday morning, February the 1st, what happens?
So I think immediately almost nothing changes, basically, because we've got a 1-year transition period with the EU anyway, during which we're still going to follow most EU rules and regulations. So we won't formally be a member, but we'll still be very closely tied to them. So immediately,
you're not going to wake up to a sort of huge whining sound from all the people that didn't want to leave.
Yeah, I think there'll be big celebrations around 11 o'clock and midnight.
Yeah.
There'll be kind of parties and understandably. But I think immediately relatively little will change. But over the course of the year, when we start negotiating our new relationship with the EU, the new trading relationship, when new trade deals start being negotiated with America and other countries, I think that's when it will really start to kick in. It'll start to feel real for people. And it'll probably be, to be honest, it'll probably be 2021 when it really feels like it's actually happened, because that's the point where we actually will detach from a lot of EU regulations and rules. So immediately not that much will change, but it will still be very symbolically important.
Yeah, I think it will. James, thank you very much indeed. This is Talk Radio TV.